What's up guys, I'm Ethan Carter and today I'm going to show you how I made this hand-stitched leather and brass desk clock. I've done a lot of leather projects, but this is the first time I took leather and tried to incorporate it into a functional piece like this. And I gotta say, I'm really happy with how the design came out and I learned a ton along the way. So I hope you enjoy, and let's get to it. For this project, I started with the brass stand, which I made out of a brass rod I found at a local hardware store. I knew I wanted it to be approximately 5 inches wide and tall, so I made two marks 5 inches apart that will become the top two corners. I then mounted the rod in a vise with one of the marks right above the vise grips, so that the mark would become the pivot point for the bend. Then with the help of my dad holding the vise down on our makeshift workstation, I used a propane torch to heat the rod at the pivot point, and then bent the rod to 90 degrees. After that, I simply flipped the rod around and repeated the same process at the other mark, and then I had the top two corners established. To create the feet for the stand, I used the same process, but instead bent the rod in the opposite direction so the feet extended back. I also made these bends slightly over 90 degrees to keep the clock from falling forward. Then I just used a cutting disc on my angle grinder to trim off the excess brass rod. One drawback to using the vise was it left some scratches on the stand, so I used a few of the buffing accessories with my Dremel to buff them out. Now this wasn't planned, but this also left a really nice brushed brass look that I ended up really liking. As Bob Ross would say, this was definitely a happy accident. With the stand done, I moved on to the leather clock. I knew the approximate shape I wanted the leather to be, but not the exact measurements, so I started by tracing the stand and then sketching the leather design to work out the measurements. Once I was happy with the design, I cut out the template and made sure it looked good on the actual stand. Since I bent the stand by eye, it wasn't precisely symmetrical, but since I drew the template referencing the actual stand, that wouldn't matter as long as I kept the top and side orientations the same, so I added an arrow on the top to help keep things straight. Next, I transferred the template onto some cardstock to make it a little easier to draw the outline on the leather itself. To cut out the leather, I used a combination of my rotary knife and an X-Acto knife, but you could easily do the whole thing with just an X-Acto knife. I knew it would be a little tricky to line up the stitching lines perfectly, so I decided to use some mini spring clamps to position the leather on the stand while I drew each of the stitch lines. Next, I used a set of inexpensive leather pricking irons to punch the stitching holes. To ensure the spacing between each hole stays consistent as I work my way down the line, I always make sure to place the pricking iron point furthest to the left in the last hole of the previous set of holes I punched. To punch the holes to the back side of the leather, I used the spring clamps again to hold it in position and then punch through both the front and back pieces using the holes I already punched as a reference. I wanted to add a stitching line in a circle to help represent a clock, so I found something that had the approximate circumference I needed and used that to draw a stitch line, and then used my pricking irons again to punch the stitch holes. To add a little strength where the clock mechanism will be mounted, I cut another circle that will be mounted to the back. To cut the hole for the clock arm to poke through, I found a circle punch just the right size out of a set I have, but you could also do this by hand since the washer will cover any imperfections. To attach the extra circle to the back, I used some EcoFlow leather weld before punching the stitch holes. With all the stitching holes punched, it was time to actually start hand stitching the leather around the brass stand using 2 needles tied to opposite ends of the same thread. There are a lot of videos out there on how to stitch to get the best results, but what I've found is easiest is to just pick a sequence and then stick to that. For example, I always start using the right needle to stitch from the back and then stitch the left needle from the front into the same hole but in front of the right needle's thread. If you continue this sequence, you'll get a very nice looking stitch pattern. For the clock to have a symmetrical look, I stitched the bottom flap too, and to weigh it down and give it a consistent look, I even stitched the leather around a small piece of brass rod. And then all that was left was to attach the clock mechanism. If you enjoyed this video, please consider hitting that subscribe and bell button. It really helps me out. I also post a lot of behind the scenes and smaller scale projects as Ethan Carter Designs on Instagram, and would love to have you follow me there as well. And with that, the clock was done. Thanks for watching.